Hello and welcome back to the fourth annual Nat King Cole Generation Hope Educators, Music Educators Conference. Our next session is entitled Trauma-Informed Pedagogy and Music Education, presented by Ramon Cardenas. Ramon Cardenas is a Ph.D. candidate in music education, choral conducting at Florida State University. He is currently the graduate assistant for vocal jazz, opera chorus, and instructor of record for a choral methods course. On top of his work as a conductor, Ramon is also a piano accompanist. Prior to his studies, Ramon taught high school choir in California for 6 years. Outside of his school duties, Ramon serves as the director of music at First Presbyterian Church in Quincy, Florida. Ramon has recently become a certified personal trainer and is passionate about helping music educators with their fitness journeys. Without any further delay, please welcome Ramon Cardenas. Good afternoon, Ramon. Thank you for being with us today.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Edrick and the Nat King Cole Foundation for letting me present this important topic today. I'm going to share my screen here so you can see my presentation. Like Edrick said, it is titled Trauma-Informed Pedagogy in Music Education. And this is something that's very important, that's very pertinent today. And basically just going to run down what this looks like in the music education classroom. But first, to understand trauma-informed pedagogy, one needs to first understand what trauma is. So several researchers have defined trauma here by first stating here that it is defined as a response to an unexpected or overwhelming violent event or events that are not fully grasped as they occur. But later on, they repeat or they come back in flashbacks, nightmares, or other repetitive phenomena. The most important aspect of this definition is that the person that is experiencing the trauma does not know that it is happening at that time. They do not fully grasp it as it is currently occurring. Another definition is that it is enigmatic by nature, meaning that it is difficult to understand. Like I mentioned, the trauma victim may not fully grasp the original event that caused the trauma, which makes it a little bit challenging to understand what trauma is. But it is important for us as educators to know how to identify those traumas. Researchers have defined traumas in many different ways, and this list by no means is exhaustive, but here are a couple ways to try to define what trauma is. First, researchers have defined it by big T and little t. Big T would be a single incident that is often life-threatening. Think of something like a natural disaster or a violent crime. Something other big T's would be something that is ongoing as well. So like abuse in the home would be considered a big T trauma. Little T trauma is something that's more personal. Think of the death of a loved one, perhaps a breakup, a transition, or losing a job. 7 more types of trauma are here. So life transitions are, if you move from one state to another, you're starting school, you're graduating from school, starting a new job, those would be all life transitions. Vicarious trauma would be experiencing trauma through the lens or through the eyes of another person. Maybe you're watching a horror movie and something happens in that movie that triggers you. That would be something that's a vicarious trauma. Or maybe you know a loved one that's experiencing something as well and that you feel affected by that. That would all be considered under the umbrella of vicarious trauma. Complex trauma is ongoing. That would be something that's a child or somebody experiencing abuse physically or emotionally. That would be considered complex. Historical and intergenerational trauma go hand in hand, and those are often seen in people of color, the BIPOC communities. Historical trauma is something that has been experienced through generations, and the child is experiencing or learning how to live life through that lens of trauma that their previous generations experienced. So think of things like slavery in the United States and how families had to navigate that and continue to navigate that now. Those would be considered historical and intergenerational types of trauma. Collective trauma would be something that we all experienced back in 2020 with COVID pandemic, or back in 2001 with the 9/11 incident. Those would be things that we all experienced together, or collective trauma. And lastly, the acute trauma is a single incident, kind of similar to the big T that we spoke of earlier, something like a natural disaster or a crime is an isolated incident of trauma. Again, like I mentioned, the most important aspect of this is not about the event itself, but the trauma and how it affects, or the impact that it leaves on people is most important. So trauma affects the body in many ways. So if you look at this chart here, when we are in a state of peace or nothing, we're not affected or triggered in any way. We are in that social engagement green portion at the bottom of this chart. And that's where we want to be at the majority of the time. But a lot of our students tend to be in either the fight or flight or freeze categories, and we need to be able to understand and look how to identify the different indicators that show us that students may be experiencing trauma. When we or a person is affected by something or triggered by something, we get into our fight or flight. But constant repetition of getting into that fight or flight ultimately gets us into that freeze mentality. And that, again, like I mentioned earlier, this happens a lot to BIPOC people who are constantly experiencing racial microaggressions throughout their life. They kind of just feel that they stay in that freeze. Students or people that experience emotional or physical or any type of abuse constantly also live in that freeze mentality. So identifying these different indicators is important for us in the classroom. So now that we've defined trauma and talking about trauma-informed pedagogy, it is an educational approach that encourages us teachers to change the way that we teach or modify our pedagogy to support the well-being of all of our students. A trauma-informed approach assumes the best intentions in our students and allows them to reach their full potential, and music educators play an integral role in that implementation of trauma-informed pedagogy. Today, we're going to discuss three topics. We're going to discuss the role of the educational institution, culturally responsive teaching within trauma-informed pedagogy, and lastly, some practical implications for us as music educators. So first, talking about the role of the educational institution. So understand that trauma-informed pedagogy ultimately begins at the macro level, and educational schools play an important role in that student identity development. So understanding those two things really play an integral role in how we can implement trauma-informed pedagogy into our classrooms. So things like policies, curriculum, pedagogy associated with certain schools can either benefit or damage identity development and subsequently affect trauma victims. For example, in some educational settings, some trauma symptoms, like we discussed earlier, you saw in that chart, may be misidentified as learning disabilities. Also, some trauma victims are more likely to experience low academic achievement, suspension, or truancy. So trauma-informed pedagogy just takes these ideas and puts context behind them. So gives students a reason as to why they're doing these things, and instead of just dismissing them as bad students. Some solutions for that. Institutions should provide these resources to help us educators implement these practices into our classrooms. Educational policies and disciplinary systems should also be modified to reflect trauma-informed pedagogy practices in education. So we can start those conversations in ways like this. We can talk about policies regarding absences, tardies, and truancies. We can talk about policies regarding uniforms used in ensembles, grading, and it's more than repertoire selection. So here are a couple of ideas to providing opportunity for student feedback, and lifelong learning as educators is ultra important as well. But if you take the second bullet point for as an example, policies regarding uniforms used in ensembles. I'm a choral director, so we have transitioned from wearing tuxedos and dresses to just wearing concert black to be more mindful of students that may be non-binary. So these are some policies that we could be mindful of and change so that we can be sure that we are catering to all of our students in our classroom in a lens of trauma-informed pedagogy. Ultimately, something that I'm going to say many times throughout this presentation is that trauma-informed pedagogy assumes the best intentions in all of our students. And in a little bit, we'll talk about culturally responsive teaching and how that looks in the classroom and how that is married with trauma-informed pedagogy. So to enact trauma-informed pedagogy in the classroom, it requires us teachers to honor culturally diverse experiences through both content and context. So those are two different things that are not mutually exclusive here. Content refers to materials used to meet those teaching standards, such as programming repertoire. And many music educators are really great at this. In fact, I think a lot of us got into the field because we were moved by music that we sang or played, and we wanted to program those pieces in the future as well. And that would be considered the content aspect. The context aspect is referring to an environment where we nurture our students so that they could feel comfortable learning new content. They are not mutually exclusive, and content and context should complement each other. Ultimately, the foundation of trauma-informed pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching begins with the creation of a safe classroom environment. And I want to talk about multiculturalism for a little bit, because oftentimes a lot of people get multiculturalism and culturally responsive teaching confused, or they say they are the same thing, but they are two different things. Multiculturalism is primarily resource-centered. So those are ideas that, you know, the different curriculum that we may use, or if you go through a website like Earth Songs or JW Pepper that have opportunities to look up multicultural pieces or music, that would be resource-centered. Culturally responsive teaching is primarily student-centered. So teaching us or giving teachers ideas on how to be able to create meaningful experiences for students with diverse backgrounds. So multiculturalism should enhance culturally responsive teaching. They are not the same thing. So here are some tips for implementing culturally responsive teaching in the classroom. First, an opportunity for feedback. I mentioned that earlier too. So we should have a dialogue between our students. Oftentimes the old model of teaching would put the teacher in the pedestal and the students are learning from the teacher, but perhaps we can create more of a collaborative environment to be able to have our students speak and give opinion and kind of interact with our curriculum a little bit more. And we also have to acknowledge and have conversations about differing backgrounds too. I think oftentimes teachers want to avoid some hard conversations because of differing backgrounds or just to be culturally sensitive. But it's important to acknowledge that we are all different and we all bring a lot of different tools to the table in the classroom. Along with that too, we have to relinquish assumptions. Like I mentioned earlier, trauma-informed pedagogy assumes the best intentions in our students. Sometimes a student walks in late and we assume the worst. Maybe we think that they were out getting Starbucks or something. And that is something that we have to relinquish, because sometimes that's not the case. They might be running late, or maybe there are other extenuating circumstances that led them to show up tardy or whatever it may be. We want to create a student-centered environment versus content-centered environment. And that's really difficult for us teachers, because we know that we have a lot of material to get through and we want to be able to share as much as possible and pass this knowledge on to our students. But ultimately, creating a student-centered environment is really what trauma-informed pedagogy focuses on. And that includes still teaching, obviously, what we need to teach, but ultimately catering to our students and their needs. Lastly, the last point today is practical implications for the music educator. So I'm dividing this section of the presentation into 3 different portions. First is that, like I've been talking about, creating that nurturing environment that's student-centered. And then we're going to talk about positive psychology and shifting our focus to positivity. And lastly, how to appropriately contextualize music. So to create a student-centered learning environments that's nurturing, first we have to create an environment that encourages students to reach their full potential, a classroom to provide students with opportunities to show their strengths, shift from teacher obligations to student well-being, and ultimately that leads for opportunity for self-reflection. And lastly, creating experiences for students, which ultimately also enhances retention. So how do we do that? So here are a couple of examples, and again, not an exhaustive list, but just some things that have worked. Student-centered assessments in a guided group context, allowing students to synthesize material and ask questions for clarification. Oftentimes we give students some sort of assessment that is the only way that they can take that test. You know, for me, I'm an anxious test taker, so the tests are hard for me to take and don't always reflect what I know. And I know a lot of our students also feel that way. So an example would be, instead of requiring a written reflection or an exam, maybe you can have a student record an audio or visual presentation in lieu of that writing component. Maybe they really are great with videography, or maybe you can let them, I don't know, write a poem, or they can come up with some sort of art format or art that they really enjoy, that can show that they know the material without requiring them to do a written test or reflection. This provides students an opportunity to show that they know the material in a way that they feel comfortable. Ultimately, also, that creates meaningful experiences for students. Students remember those projects that when they are able to get hands-on with the learning, that's what they remember the most. So ultimately, that also promotes student retention. A nurturing environment also begins when students are given the opportunity to engage in dialogue on what pedagogical approaches work best for them. So that means that we give students an opportunity to tell us, this is not really working for me. So is there a way that we can you teach this again? Because I think that I need this explained again in a different way. That gives students an opportunity to take ownership of the way that they learn. A couple more ideas. We can also encourage our students to self-regulate in the classroom. So how can we do that? So there are a couple ways to do this. First, you can implement guided journal prompts. So if you're conducting a piece or you're teaching a piece, you can give them an opportunity to explore what that piece means to them, or what does that piece remind them of. You could also provide brain breaks during class time. So that could look that could take two different opportunities in the class. It could be a form of retrieval, and also an opportunity to build community. For example, for a form of retrieval, you can, as a brain break, you can tell your students to turn to your neighbor and list 3 things we rehearsed in measures 28 through 45 yesterday. So that way you're transitioning from one piece to another. It gives them an opportunity to take a little bit of a brain break while also talking to each other and retrieving information that they learned yesterday as well. It's also an opportunity to build community. You can ask your students, turn to your neighbor and tell them what your favorite cartoon was as a kid. These are all just small little things that we can implement into our classroom that take maybe 30 seconds of our time, but give students an opportunity to self-regulate, and also an opportunity for them to build relationships with each other. Yeah, another way to self-regulate in the classroom too is to encourage physical movement. So you can give them an opportunity to connect with the music, or with the ensemble director, and with themselves. But the only thing with physical movement, though, is just remember that you never want to force a student to do something that they're not comfortable with. So to create that comfortability for students to do these things, you have to create that nurturing environment first. So now, talking about student-centered learning and what our role as a teacher is, trauma-informed pedagogy encourages educators to look inward and seek ways to understand their own trauma, or our own trauma responses. Inward reflection will also help provide a proactive learning environment where students are encouraged to engage in the reflective process. Meaning that trauma-informed pedagogy only works when us educators know how to regulate our own trauma. That in turn will encourage students to focus on their own physical and emotional regulation. So it's important. Trauma-informed pedagogy is not just about students, but it also encourages teachers to ensure that we're looking for ways to actively regulate our own trauma and the way that we process information. Ultimately, the nature of trauma leads humans to maintain a survival mode mentality. That means that relinquishing the survival mode mentality requires the acknowledgement that trauma exists. And that sometimes means that we have to have difficult conversations with each other. So an example of that would be racial trauma. Not many people want to talk about race, and simply approaching education as I am a colorblind educator can often dismiss the stories and experiences of students outside the racial majority. And for many of our white teachers, that is more than just acknowledging our privilege. It sometimes means getting into those difficult conversations and having those conversations with our students so that we can better understand them and know how to serve them. One of my teachers, one of my professors at Florida State mentioned that racial acknowledgement is like brushing your teeth, that it must be done daily, that it is something that we have to actively do to be able to overcome that trauma. A couple more things for you to be mindful of in student-centered learning. So the first thing is being mindful of your words. So oftentimes we might say things that to us may seem innocuous, but to students might be very harmful. So inappropriate jokes, like for example, you might say, maybe someday you forgot your glasses and you say something like, oh my goodness, I forgot my glasses, I'm blind. But you might have a student that's visually impaired in the class. So you want to avoid jokes that might unintentionally trigger students or harm students in some ways. You also want to be mindful of the way that you talk about music and just the way that you just approach just education in general, because we are, as teachers, to our students, we are a form of authority, and they will take what we say to heart oftentimes. And if we talk about, and when we're talking about music and we dismiss a certain type of music saying that, oh, I don't like that genre because of whatever reason, or I just don't like how it sounds, but a person or a student might really love that genre. You have to be mindful of the way that you talk about it, because you don't want to dismiss what their loves are, especially with music, because ultimately all types of music are important. I like to tell my students to not yuck someone's yum. Just because you don't like it, it doesn't mean that you should dismiss it because somebody else might really love that. Another example too is referring to a group of people as guys, kind of like we talked earlier about the policies regarding uniforms in ensembles. There are many students that are exploring identity, their gender identities during the adolescent years. So we don't want to accidentally trigger or upset a student by referring to them as guys. You want to pick a gender neutral term when referring to a group of people. And ultimately, as a teacher, discussing trauma does not necessarily have to be the only focus of trauma-informed pedagogy. You can implement these things into the classroom without having to consistently talk about trauma. So to create a student-focused environment, here's a quote that Walter wrote, saying, the essence of music education requires humans to connect with one another. A part of this connection must allow opportunity for discussion of the human experience. And the human experience is incomplete without discussion of grief and trauma. Therefore, human connection is an integral part of trauma-informed pedagogy. And that's so true. We often just want to focus on the positive aspects of what we're going through. But our human experience is not just all about those happy times. We all experience some sort of trauma, and we have to be able to talk about those things, or at least discuss or address those things personally to be able to overcome them. Another quote here is, build the resilience by building the relationships. Less prep, more presence. Meaning you want to create those environments where we are really there for our students and helping them interact with each other and creating those communities that we love in music education. The next thing is shifting our focus to positivity. So this is divided into two different aspects. First is behavior modification, and the second is the resilient mindsets, both which deal with trauma-informed pedagogy. First, behavior modification in context of trauma-informed pedagogy, it uplifts students rather than punishing them. So trauma-informed pedagogy believes that every behavior has a source, and and we have to assume the best intention of that source as well. Trauma-informed pedagogy roots itself in positive psychology, which is defined as the paradigm that studies well-being, human strength, and optimal functioning in the individuals, groups, and organizations. So tying these two things together is really important, because we have to assume that we have to assume the best intention, and that includes uplifting them rather than punishing them. So we as educators should examine our approaches to classroom behavior modification and seek ways to ensure students are not being punished. So an example for me, I used to work at Redlands East Valley High School out in California. And in my first period, I taught an intermediate treble ensemble. And it was pretty early. And I had a student that I had for all 4 years. But as a freshman, I had her first period, and she was always late to that class. And this was prior to me going through my own soul searching with trauma-informed pedagogy and all of these things that we're talking about. So I was assuming that she was just, showing up late just to show up late. Perhaps I thought that she was sleeping in, or like I mentioned earlier, maybe going to Starbucks, hanging out with friends, you name it. I think we've all been in that place where we assume that a student is late because of one of those reasons. but instead of talking to her, I just continued to just assume that she was just late because of those reasons. And I never addressed that with her. I went to her counselor though to kind of see what the issue was. And the counselor enlightened me that the reasons why she was late was because her parents both worked really early in the day, earlier than the school day, or they would leave for work, and they had no ride. And she had a younger brother who she had to get to the middle school, and then she would walk to the middle school and then walk to the high school. And that's why she was late every single day, because she had to do a walk at least 2 miles a day in the morning. So that really just opened my eyes to just be mindful of the fact that all these students don't necessarily have bad or bad intentions when they are late or when they do something in the classroom. So trauma-informed pedagogy assumes the best intention, and it gives a reason to gives a reason to students and their behaviors in the classroom. Another aspect of positive psychology is resilient mindsets, which is a practice within trauma-informed pedagogy. And that is essentially the acknowledgement that students are consistently making resilient choices. An example of this: we as educators understand the obligation of attending school or our job every day. A student or an adolescent attending school every day, despite experiencing mitigation and frustration at school, is an act of resilience. Here are a couple more examples. So if a student is going to school and they are constantly being bullied, but they are still showing up, that is an example of resilience. So we as educators should acknowledge that they are that they are experiencing that a resilience, and we have to be able to create those relationships by encouraging them and by telling them, thank you so much for showing up today. I know today that you're going through a lot right now. I know that you're experiencing this at home, or I know that you're going through this with this person, but that thank you and that gratitude goes a long way. Another example of that would be if a child comes home to share their stories for the day. You know, a child, think of like a 6 or 7-year-old, their universe is so much smaller compared to ours. And like maybe they experience something like in the playground during recess that really hurt them or that they really wanted to share. And then us as parents, maybe we dismiss that, or oh, that's no big deal, you'll get over that. You know, but to a child, that's their whole world. So the resilient mindset just acknowledges that, you know, we all go through our own trauma and our own subjective experiences, and we have to acknowledge that they are meaningful still, that those things matter. So acknowledgement and gratitude are subtle techniques in trauma-informed pedagogy. An example here, like I mentioned earlier, I'm so thankful that you're here today. I know the semester is very hard right now, and I'm glad that you decided to show up to rehearsal today. Those comments and those acts of gratitude and acknowledgement can go a really long way. And resilient mindset is a really important aspect of trauma-informed pedagogy. Again, we have to relinquish those assumptions that students are doing something bad, we deem as bad behavior, because they just want to be that way. Every behavior has a source, and trauma-informed pedagogy assumes the best intention in that. So why do we do that? Why is acknowledgement of resilience so important? Psychological dismissal of a place or group of people is a coping mechanism. So if you think of, I think we've all met a student that says, I hate school, or I hate this, because they probably have experienced something that have led them to feel that way. So an example, maybe it's like I mentioned earlier, a student maybe is being bullied at school, and that may lead them to dismiss all educational institutions and adults. Maybe a student has a really bad experience with a teacher or an adult, and that also leads them to hate school. And so that is reasons why we have to acknowledge and be grateful for these students. A little bit more personal example for music, maybe a student auditions for an ensemble and does not make it to the group that they wanted to be in, and that leads them to dismiss music altogether. So we have to navigate ways to ensure that we are acknowledging our students and their experiences in our schools and our classrooms. Assuming good intention and acknowledging acts of resilience may be the initial steps needed to help students relinquish from traumatic cycles. And lastly, talking about appropriately contextualizing music. So dividing this into 3 different topics here. First, we'll talk about repertoire selection, and then we'll talk about doing the work and doing the research to select repertoire. and then ultimately creating a rehearsal space that puts process over product. So first, talking repertoire selection, music, as we all know, plays an important role in recounting human experiences, and we as musicians have the power to illustrate those traumatic events through performance. Sometimes, though, those representations of traumatic events result in trivializing a composition to make performances more accessible to audience. An example right now in choral music is perhaps programming a spiritual at the end of a set because it ends with an 8-part split fortissimo, or it's bombastic in nature, or it's big. So a lot of people want to end that way because they think that the audiences will love that end. But that's trivializing the experiences of the composers of that spiritual. Educators can and should research the history of all of our repertoire selections and teach the students the composer's intentions. Here are some ideas for you in repertoire selections. First, you want to provide opportunity for dialogue. When you select a piece, you want to be able to engage in those difficult conversations about those pieces. So when you select a piece, you want to be ready and prepared to be able to have conversations that may be difficult with your students. With your audiences, perhaps you can write program notes about a piece so that you can teach them about what that piece is about. We as educators must know our concert program beyond the notes and rhythms. Discussions of each piece and its history and related trauma help contextualize the music for the performers. And that ultimately provides an opportunity to appropriately convey emotions akin to the music. And I stand by this too. I think that educators maybe should not select repertoire that they are unwilling to discuss. And that's challenging because we often want to program pieces outside of the Western canon, but maybe we could have someone that's a culture bearer from whatever culture you select a piece from to be able to come and talk to you or your students about appropriately contextualizing that music so that it is honored and the composer and their intentions are honored. Learning notes, rhythms, and dynamics is the baseline. And we have to have those conversations to be able to teach our students about the repertoire. Like I mentioned earlier, for our audiences, you can provide program notes that help give just a brief historical backgrounds or cultural background on the piece so that they can know what you're singing or playing about. Discussing trauma in the classroom, you want to avoiding discussions may lead to a lack of understanding history that emerged from trauma. So for example, without understanding slavery in United States history, an educator will not fully grasp the spirituals that emerge from those traumatic experiences. So we must, as educators, research each piece that we program for our ensembles and prepare to engage in meaningful dialogue, dissecting the historical and background of these compositions, including the traumatic events that inspired these pieces of music. Ultimately, though, this can be done after creating a nurturing environment. You don't want to just jump into a conversation without creating that rapport with your students first, because some of these conversations can be pretty difficult and triggering. One of my mentors at Florida State often says that you do not learn in a state of comfortability. So we have to kind of just be pushing that uncomfortability a little bit more so that we can really be in this full and fully learn it into the fullest capacity. And lastly, talking about highlighting the process over the product. So meaningful dialogue begins when the process or our daily rehearsal experiences outweigh the product, the performance. If you think about it, we often, we get maybe 1 or 2 performances, but we see our students sometimes every single day. So we have to ensure that we are providing that opportunity to highlight the process over the product for our students. In music, the product often becomes the sole purpose of what we do. And that leads us to place a significant amount of focus on ensuring notes, rhythms, and articulations are at a high level for performance. And yes, obviously those things are very important, but we want to still provide students with that opportunity to hold on to the process, and because those are the memories that we make every single day. Although these are important factors that contribute to successful music education, educators must remember to connect the process of making music to the human experience. So here are some takeaways for you for the things we've talked about today. First, remain within your scope. Talking about trauma-informed pedagogy and the privilege of being a music educator, a lot of our students may come to us with some deeply personal things because we establish those rapport, those relationships with them. So we have to ensure that when a student comes to us, that we know that we can guide them in the right direction if they need it. Like we're probably able to give advice about general things, but if a student is experiencing things that are more serious, like abuse in the home, then you know you need to go to the right channels to ensure that students are getting the help that they need. So please remember that in trauma-informed pedagogy, we also must remain within our scope. The number two, second thing I want to give you to take away is to create meaningful experiences for your students. Ultimately, like I mentioned earlier, that also enhances retention. But the most important aspect of that is that we are able to create meaningful environments or nurturing environments for our students to learn. Trauma-informed pedagogy assumes the best intentions in all of our students. So remembering that every single behavior has a source, and trauma-informed pedagogy assumes the best intention for that behavior. And remember that the process should outweigh the product. What we do in rehearsal is more important than the actual performance, because that's the time that we are able to have those conversations with our students, build rapport with our students, and create that community that we all join music education for as well. So highlighting process over product is a very important aspect of trauma-informed pedagogy. And also, obviously, as music educators, we listen for music, we use our ears, but we also have to be willing to listen to our students, give them opportunity for them to provide feedback for us, listen to their stories, listen to the ways that they interact with the world, because we can learn so much from them. But ultimately, that also helps us be able to cater to what they need from us as well. And again, this ties back to assuming the best intentions. You want to relinquish negativity towards our students. It's so easy to get into this tunnel vision as teachers that we have to get all of our information, we have to get all of our things done, and we have to teach all the content. But I encourage you to relinquish those ideas and ensure that we're creating a student-centered environment versus a content-centered environment. And thank you so much. That is my presentation for the day.
Thank you so much, Ramon. You just gave me an epiphany. I was just thinking, you mentioned process over product. I just want to share this very quick. I probably shared this at the last year's conference. One morning, one of my students, the bell rang for first period, and the student came by my office and said, "Mr. Rhodes, you have the luckiest person in the world." And I was like, okay, what does that mean? And he was like, "You get to be in a band room all day," and I was like, "Oh, okay." But it didn't really resonate on how fact of we all of our students, if they're done with a course, they get to pass where? Back to the chorus room, back to the band room, back to the theater room, always getting to pass, come back to us. And they'll just hang out or practice because they want to feel like they're not missing anything. Like my 3-year-old son, who don't want to take a nap because he don't want to miss anything, right? And so when I think about this, it's in the band room or the chorus room where the process takes place. And then the product is oftentimes the venue. Because we're always telling our ensembles, don't leave your best performance in the band room, because they'll perform incredibly, and then you get to to the venue, and then then sometimes it falls short or whatever it may be. But just talking about the process over product, process for those students is at home because they spend a lot of time in our rooms more than their own bedroom or their own home. So if you think about it in the sense of process being home, that's where they feel most comfortable. We have to cherish those moments with them and think of the product as a one-time performance, probably at another venue. They're not most comfortable, but it's a process that we need to make sure we value all the way through the process of whatever pedagogy or content we're rolling out.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
No, thank you for that. You talk about mindful words, and I think in being mindful in general. And is there any, don't want to put you on a spot, but any suggested words? I mean, I've been in ensembles. I go do a lot of clinicianing, and you hear some directors go, "Okay, you guys play as written, and you guys play the part that I just kind of edited for you." And it just comes out. You don't really think about it. It's not malicious, but we
Right.
do have to be mindful. Is there any suggested words that you could probably, suggest for our educators in that first step of being sometimes mindful of our words?
Yeah, thank you. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is just when you greet somebody or when you're referring to a section, maybe referring to them as everybody. So when I start a class, I usually say hi everybody instead of hi guys or hi ladies if it's a treble ensemble. Or you can refer to them. I'm a choral person, so instead of saying you guys, you can say tenors and basses or sopranos and altos. Can you do this? Because we also have singers that their voices might not reflect their gender. So I have some male singers that sing soprano, and vice versa as well. Some female singers that sing tenor. So you don't want to always refer to them as ladies or as guys because there might be other genders or other genders as well. And I'm in the South, so y'all, it also works really well because that's a gender neutral term. That's what I use in the classroom.
Great. Well, we have a couple questions before we exit out. So this work is important for all of our students and overall school climate. This is from a attendee. How can educators influence other teachers or administrators to adopt a trauma-informed lens?
Yeah, I think that, like I mentioned, we can start those conversations. So we often have professional development days in whatever respective schools we teach. So perhaps we could encourage or talk to our administration about trauma-informed pedagogy, and maybe we could invite speakers to come and talk about what trauma-informed pedagogy looks like in the classroom. But if that's not something that's actively being talked about in your school, then I think it's important that we start those conversations too. Because a lot of this is, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is something that's fairly new to a lot of educators. So introducing this might come from from you, or it might come from me, and that those conversations can really get the ball rolling to invite people that are really comfortable with trauma-informed pedagogy to give ideas to every educator in a respective institution.
Absolutely. We had an attendee just say, good information just affirms why we must connect with our students before doing curriculum. And if we do this, like Ramon said, everything will come together.
Absolutely.
So I agree with that. Question for you, we probably have room for one more. In Florida, there's FVA, FBA, and solos and ensembles is a very, critical time in the very early part of January, February. I know for band world, how would you help guide a student solos and ensembles? That's, our students get traumatized when they're doing solos or take a solo. Could you give us some promising practices, if you will, for maneuvering that student to build confidence and not feel so overstressed when taking a solo, or if they're doing a solo or playing in a part where there's exposure that may be, whether it be in the choral world or instrumental world
Yeah, I
or
think
orchestral world.
absolutely. I think the first thing that comes to mind is perhaps giving the student an opportunity to maybe record their solo at home individually. And after they record that, then they can maybe play that for the ensemble so that they could all see. Or another idea too is maybe have a pair of students or a very small group of students play a solo together so that it's not necessarily the entire ensemble, but just a small group already feels a little bit like there's pressure there because there's maybe 3 or 4 people playing or singing. But that smaller, you're still in context of other people too. So you don't feel like you're completely on the spot because there are other people there to serve as buffers. So little by little, you are essentially removing, I guess, person by either the video aspect or the group aspect until they feel comfortable. But I think ultimately you want to encourage students in a way that doesn't force them to do it, something that they don't want to do. So giving opportunities to maybe play the solo for just the teacher, or maybe play it for just their friends, and then hopefully that eventually gives them the comfortability or just the trust to be able to play in front of the entire ensemble that ultimately leads to playing for either festival or the concert as well.
Yeah, I agree. So basically, is what we know in education as scaffolding.
Yes.
but we're doing some guided scaffolding for the individual student. Got it. It's great. Well, thank you so much, Ramon, for sharing such an exceptional insight regarding accommodations within music education. On behalf of the Nat King Cole Generation Hope, we thank you for being with us today and sharing your promising practices and the research you're doing. We want to wish you best of luck in your doctoral journey. We know you're going to be thriving and hearing from you very soon on some other exceptional work that you're doing. So, Ramon, thank you so much for your presentation today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Well, friends, we will now take a very short break. Again, if you want to grab a beverage, stretch, anything you need to do to refresh yourself before our last session of the day, and we'll start promptly in about 4.5 minutes. Thank you.